To finish our discussion on what the production possibilities frontier is. So again, what we're looking at is the most amount of healthcare education we can do. But again, this can apply to any two goods, right? So coffee and tea, trucks and shirts, right? It's just showing us the possible combinations of two goods that a country can do given all of its resources. So a country is producing productively efficient if they are on the production possibilities frontier. Really, what productive efficiency is, it is impossible to produce more of one good without decreasing the quantity of another good. So basically, it's think about when you're at a job and you're doing the best you can at making coffee, and then your boss asks you to make tea at the same time. If you're producing efficiently, you have to do less coffee to make more tea, right? If he were to ask you to make more coffee and more tea, it's just outside of your production possibilities, right? You just can't do it. You are already producing efficiently as possible. So that would mean productive efficient, right? It's impossible to do more of one good without giving up the other one. So any choice inside the production possibility frontier is productively inefficient. So this one shows us that it is possible to do more of the other good, and it doesn't cost you of the other good. So basically on this one, let's say you're just lazy, not really doing much, all right, and your boss asks you to do more tea. You can do the same amount of coffee and also produce more tea because you were producing inefficiently before. One example of producing inefficiency in terms of a country is having more unemployment. You have the possibility of producing more, but because people are unemployed, they're not working, you're not producing as efficiently as possible. Okay, so here on this points A, B, C, D, and F, all of these points are efficient. Okay, so remember, if you are efficient, then you are on the line. Okay, if you are at point R, this is inefficient. Okay, so anything on the inside here is what we would consider productively inefficient. And the reason it's inefficient is because, look here, if you were to go from B to D, which is producing more education, you did have to give up some healthcare, right? Because you are efficient. Now, if you are at point R and you did more education, it doesn't cost you any healthcare. You are still producing the same amount of healthcare if you are at point R because you were inefficient. But going back to the example of your boss asking you to do more coffee and more tea, but you were efficient and it wasn't possible, he was basically asking you to do more of this, right, and the same amount of the other one. But look, you're way over here. You are outside of your production possibilities. So anything that is in this region over here on the outside is what we would consider unattainable. Unattainable in the sense that given your current resources, you cannot produce this amount of goods. All right. So in terms of the coffee and tea, if your boss were to ask you to do the same amount of coffee but more tea, you're going to need to say like, hey, I need a better espresso machine to produce coffee faster. That way I can make the same amount of coffee and make the tea at the same time, right? You would need more resources. So if we saw an increase in population, an increase in funding, right? Something that was going to increase your resources, land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. If we saw an increase in one of those things, then we would see a shift out in the production possibilities frontier, and then we would have a new efficiency point. All right. So again, if you're on the line, you are efficient. All of these points here are equal in efficiency. They are on the line, they're all efficient. Anything on the inside is inefficient, anything on the outside is unattainable. Now we do have one more type of efficiency called allocative efficiency. This one is we're looking at the mix of goods where the mix is what society most desires. This one varies by what your country is looking for. So going back to this example of healthcare and education, if you have much more of a younger population, you might want to focus more on education. So you would pick point D. Point D is showing us that we're having more education. But if you had an older population, people are retiring, need healthcare, maybe you would pick point B, which has more healthcare but less education. Realistically, there is only one allocated efficient point because it's what your society most desires. All of these points are productive. A, B, C, D, and F, those are all productive efficient, but there's only one allocative efficient point. All right. We can also use the production possibility curve to find opportunity cost. So looking here between coffee and tea, if we go from 0 tea and 500 coffee, if we go to point A, right, you are doing 47 more tea, but what did it cost you, right? Opportunity cost. You went from 500 coffees to now 490. So how much did you give up? You gave up 10, all right? Now going from A to B, you gained another tea, but how much did it cost you? You went from here to here. You went from 490 coffee at point A to 475 coffee at point B. So you gave up 15. All right. And if you went another one, you went from B to C, right? And you gained another T. Well, how much did it cost you? You had to go from 475 coffees down to 400, so it cost you 75. And then finally, if you were to do another T, that's going to cost you coffee. All right, so we're looking at going from 400 down to 0. So producing that 50th T, the extra one, going from C to point D, that costs you 400 coffee. Again, showing us the increasing opportunity cost. You can see here that you go 10, 15, 75, and 400. So we are seeing that increasing opportunity cost. Okay. Again, the main thing, some students get confused by going from A to B. They start going from 500 down to 475 and they say 25. That's not what it is. It's all about going from what point to one point. So you got to look at these little steps here. It's not the total amount, right? It's just the marginal, right? It's just looking at those little steps that are being done. That is your opportunity cost. Okay. The next thing we'll talk about is an economic approach to things. So when you're thinking economically, we do have two types of statements that we like to look at because realistically, people, firms, and society do not have to act in this way of economic way of thinking. It is something that you should be thinking about, right? Maybe you're even doing it without realizing it. And so what we do in economics is really separate statements into two ways of thinking. There's positive statements and normative statements. So the question is, you know, should people, firms, societies should act in this way, or maybe they should not act in this way? See, this is like an opinion, right? I'm asking you, should we act with this critical way of thinking with economically, or should we do something else, right? And that's an opinion. Opinions is what we call normative statements, right? Where basically you're saying society should be this way, or I think we should have more coffee and less tea, right? That is an opinion. So that's a normative statement. Positive statements, on the other fact, are facts, okay? Like if I were to describe the economy and say, okay, economic growth is 3.2%, and inflation is 2.8%, unemployment is 3.7%, right? In terms of the calculations, those are facts. Those are positive statements. So when I say all of this data that we're given, those are positive statements. Now, given the positive data, the positive statements, we can make a normative statement about it. So I could say, based off of economic growth, inflation, and unemployment numbers, maybe we're in a expansion period. The economy is going really well. Somebody else will take that data and say, actually, I think we're heading towards a recession. We're looking at the same positive statements, but we have two ways of looking at it, right? Are we in an expansion period? Are we heading towards a recession, right? We have two different ways of thinking. That is where the normative statements come in. So if you're looking at society about we should do this, right? That's the key word with normative statements. It should or ought to. We ought to do this. Those are normative statements. The way the facts are saying it is, right? So employment is 3.2%, right? Is the key word that you're looking for in terms of a positive statement. One normative statement that we did look at from Adam Smith is called the invisible hand theory. So his normative statement was basically that people are self-interested, and that that could lead to positive social outcomes. The example here I like to give is when you see trash on the side of the road, or if you're walking on a sidewalk and you see a wrapper or a cup on the ground, do you pick it up? And, you know, are you doing it because you want a better society? Okay, if the answer is yes, right, then the invisible hand theory says you don't need a government authority telling you to pick up trash. You're doing it yourself, right? So because of your self-interested behavior, you're leading to a positive social outcome. So that was his normative statement about the way things should be, right? We don't necessarily need government actions in everything because people are self-interested in wanting a better society, right? Just an example. But in terms of economic questions that you should be thinking about if you were to have your own economy, it really comes down to three basic questions. Here's how I like to think about it. If you were on an island and you're stranded there and you're trying to survive, there are three questions that you should be asking yourself, okay? So you're looking out around the island and you got to figure out, how am I going to survive? I need to figure out what I have, right? We need to figure out what to produce. Okay, so basically we're looking around and we see that we have coconuts up in the trees, right? So that's what we're going to produce. The next question would be, how do we get it? How to produce it. All right. And then finally the question becomes, once we get that coconut, whom gets it? All right. So whom to produce, or how do we distribute the goods to, right? So, you know, one way of thinking is a command economy saying like, hey, I got the coconut, so I get to decide how we distribute it. That's one example. A market economy would say, hey, I got the coconut, you got to figure out something to trade with me for it. So that's how we figure out how to produce. So those are the three questions we need to figure out. What, how, and for whom. The questions we already know, right? We already know where. That's here, right? The island. We need to figure out, you know, what and how to do it here. We already know the answer to where. And we also know the why, you know, because we're trying to survive. Okay? So the what, how, and whom, those are the questions that you should be asking for any economic system. These questions are the driving force for the market, because if consumers want something, then the market's going to supply it. And it has to figure out how to do that. People are demanding something. We need to fill that demand somehow. Okay? In the next chapter, we'll actually talk about the supply and demand factors.